perspective on who's here and which tracks are represented. So if we could perhaps start on this side. If we could just say your name and the track you're with.
Dave Pearl at the Rainbow Track. And Sports, Palm Beach Lake Track. Art Sports, Palm Beach Lake. Toby Thorne, Spring Creek Track. June Story, Alpine Falls Track.
Tom McKinney, Alpine Falls Track.
Peter Steinhardt, Palm Beach. Ken Martin, Spring Creek.
Dale Kramer, Falls Lake Road.
Mike out, Rainbow Track.
Joe Athey, Rainbow Tracks.
Holden Brink, Rainbow Track. Tom Weichen Bridge. Alan Ivey, Echo Lake.
Greg Ellis, Echo Lake.
Tom Frankel, Spring Creek Track. Aaron Larson, Spring Creek. Sit down.
Mary Burnett, Emerald Bay. Anna Pitcher, Echo Summit Road North. Carol Latimer, Echo Road North.
John Anderson, Echo Summit South. Ed Constantine, Echo Road South.
Patty Montali, Echo Summit.
Joel Frank, Echo Summit Road and Echo Summit. 2 tracks.
Don Smith, Lower Emerald Bay Track.
David Diepenbrock, Emerald Bay.
Victoria Alvarez, Rainbow Track.
Bob LaBelle, Echo Lake.
Tom Luter, Rainbow Track.
Jackie Luter, Rainbow Track.
Rhina and Sonia Dosa, Rainbow Track.
Sonia Doza, Rainbow Track. Rainbow Summer Home Track. Summer Home.
Gordon Fox, South Shore Track, Echo Lake.
Paul Malmoker, Echo Lake Road Track.
Bill Knox, North Shore, Echo Lake.
Terry Class, Echo Lake Road Track.
Mike Swinson, Fur Craig's Track.
Greg Galvin, Rainbow Estates. Steve Tallman, Fallen Leaf Lake Track.
Ed George's Rainbow Track.
Kathy Julian, Rainbow Track.
Mike West, Echo Summit North.
Catherine Strait, Echo Summit North. Jeannie Pitney, Spring Hill Track. Joe Howard. Spring Creek. Joe Howard, Echo Lake, South Shore. Sally Gooden, Echo Lake.
Rich Best, South Shore, Echo Lake.
Butch Collins, South Shore.
Echo Lake.
Excellent. Really good spectrum of representation. I could just find maybe one track not represented today. So it's fantastic that you're all here. We really appreciate it. Sort of to kick things off, I'd like to invite Nancy Gibson up to say a couple words of welcome. Get us started here.
Good morning. And I don't have the height advantage as Jonathan, so I hope you can see me over this podium. It's rather large. Good morning. I am really pleased to see the turnout that we have. And to give a perspective, while we have so many of the members here present today, we manage 594 rec residences here on the Lake Tahoe Basin. And so that comes with it profound responsibility to manage these in a historical nature for which Congress intended way back in the early part of the 19th century. And so we all take that responsibility very seriously. And we know that with the changing times and changing legislation, there are bound to be questions, concerns, and needs for clarification. And I'm really pleased that we have today our expert here in the group today, because these are the folks that work, live, and breathe with these regulatory requirements day in and day out. And they are here to help answer any questions and provide any clarification that they can. So as Jonathan said, the agenda is really set up to help go through the particulars in what we're doing here with this appraisal process, how this appraisal process really has evolved over time. And I'm sure all of you have seen the newsletter that came out with the mailing that helped explain quite a bit of that history. So So again, we want to make sure that people understand how and why we're at this place today, and to make sure that we provide whatever necessary clarifications that you all have. We also will break at lunch and then have the afternoon dedicated to the questions and answer period. So if there are anything from either the flyer or the morning discussion that still are not clear, we really encourage you to be sure and voice those come this afternoon. Again, I am looking forward to having this opportunity to learn with you, as I have Jonathan and folks here that are the experts. I am clearly not the expert in rep residence and the appraisal process, so I will be learning along with you, and recognize that, again, any of those questions you may have, let's be sure that they are surfaced, so that by the time we leave, there are no questions left, or certainly there is a greater understanding of what this process is. So again, thank you for fighting wind, rain, snow, sleet, other things to get here today. I look forward to a very productive work session with all of you, and we can move forward and better understand this process for all of us. So thank you. Jonathan is the MC.
That's correct. Okay. Let's get started here. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the expectations and the outcomes that we might expect from today. So the presentation is going to be divided into 4 sections. We're going to start off with CUFA. The Cabin User Fee Fairness Act really forms the foundation for everything we're going to discuss today. Now, you all are lucky. Amongst you are several individuals who are actively engaged in what may be new legislation for cabin fees. But that's not really what today's presentation is about. We are tasked with the continued implementation of CUFA. If we want to talk CFA, we're prepared to do that, but perhaps that's a side session or something we can do at break or over lunch even. But today is really about CUFA. Part 2, we really want to share with you what is the overview of the market in 2010. The one individual I have yet to introduce is Lance, who is our contract appraiser. Lance is going to walk us through that data gathering that he did, and sort of how did he develop fees and not fees, but values for the typical lots. The third portion will be a discussion of the second appraisal process and the establishment of fees. Where does that come from? What if there are 2 appraisals? How does Nancy get to set the fee? And then the last section will be the Q&A. So let's go ahead and jump into CUFA. Again, we're going to have a handout here. We're going to provide you a couple different handouts. First is CUFA legislation itself. CUFA being the foundation for what we're going to talk about today, it's really important that you see sort of the particulars in that law. A lot of the questions we've been receiving by email and voice are answered specifically in the legislation. Often the Forest Service develops its own policies and procedures when it comes to special uses or establishing fee and things of that nature. Well, recreation residences is actually one of those program areas where the agency was really secondary to the law passed by Congress, and that's what CUFA represents. The second handout being provided to you might be described as the legislative history or discussion that was taking place regarding the 5%. Why is it 5% of the appraised value? Well, we wanted to provide you any information we had that kind of related to that, and that's what the second handout is. So folks should have 2 handouts.
We need about 4 more. Okay, so just 1. We'll get going that way.
Please raise your hand if you're missing any of the handouts. We look like we're good. We got a couple more over here. In the front row here. Fantastic. We also, well, we benefit in that CUFA is largely the kind of law you can read and make sense of. Often laws are written somewhat vague or without specific direction. I wanted to point out a couple key sections, at least based on what I feel is most of the feedback we've received to date. Let's start first with section 607. So if you turn to page 3, it's actually it's printed back and front. 1, 2, 3, 4, page 5, but it's the third sheet. You'll notice that section 607 states specifically what the fee for recreation residents will be on national forest. And it is identified at 5%. We've had a lot of questions about why is it 5%. Now that other handout will describe to you sort of the iterative process that was ongoing back in Washington, D.C. that landed on that 5%. But we wanted to make sure you specifically knew kind of where it came from. Now, right above section 607 on the same page, you will see the reappraisal for and recalculation of base, tab, and user fee. Do you see that under D, just above 607? That's what establishes that 10-year interval cycle. So a lot of folks have also asked the question, why is the Forest Service doing this? Well, the direction to do this, the timing, the fees, all of that can be found in this legislative act. So that's where we are today. Now, Kim's going to introduce some concepts related to the appraisal itself, and what does CUFA say about how should we conduct an appraisal to establish that value.
Hi, everyone. I just want to go over a little bit about the evaluation process as per CUFA, and it's probably the same spiel as if you were out there, and I think most of you were, when you were out there doing the lot visits. It's what I explained before.
A little louder, please.
Sure. So, with CUFA, getting to your fee is a two-part process. So the first part is coming up what we call the market value of your lot. And that's what the Forest Service contracted out with various appraisers to do, is come up with the market value of your lot. In that process, we were told, we were given sideboards as to what to consider and what not consider. So it was, for the most part, for our appraisers, or our contract appraisers, to take on was what we call a hypothetical assignment, okay? So they were appraising something that really technically doesn't exist, okay? But that's because CUFA gave us these sideboards to come up with market value. As an appraiser, I appreciated those sideboards because it made it a little bit more black and white. And the appraisal process is gray sometimes at best. So the more we can make things a little bit more black and white for the appraisal process, the easier it is for me and those contract appraisers. So we were told to pretend it's a lot in private ownership, okay? The number one hypothetical. Number two, we were to pretend that there were no improvements on those lots that were made by the permit holder, okay? Obviously your cabins, that's a given. A lot of these lots had permittee provided water systems. The permit holders may have paid, if you had any type of other utility on your lot, you may have paid for the drop lines from the main lines to be put in. You may have paid, and most likely so, for internal track roads to be put in and maintained. Anything that was put in by the permit holder was not accounted for in the valuation. The only thing with the situation with water, we assume that lots had water, that there just was no developed delivery system for the water. There were special circumstances on other forests that they were technically dry lots. But for the most part, that assumption was that water was there. It was just up to whoever, let's say, would buy that lot to come up with a delivery system for that water to be made available. Other things we could take into account is the season of access, and that was pretty much an an average. When we talked to you out on the ground, you would told us average when you could get in and out of your cabins. And sometimes it's a personal choice about using your cabins or not during the winter season. We have some permit holders, because on some tracks you are not allowed in. On some tracks you are. We have people that snowshoe in, we have people that snowmobile in and use their cabins all the time. So that was a little bit, it depended on the track, but we took basically what folks said. If they only got in there 4 months out of the year, 5 months, 3 months, whatever, we took that as kind of the running average. We have some seasons that we can't get in as often as we like, and we have some seasons of a little bit more drier years that we can get in and use it a little bit more. It was an average.
As
Yeah.
a recent cabin owner, we purchased about 10 years ago. When did these discussions happen? When you said that these discussions happened with cabin owners. When was that?
When we came out for this, for the Lake Tahoe Basin to go over this, it was 2010. In August 2010, when we were out there doing the actual appraisal work. We had meetings at each track for each site visit. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. So, let's see, where was I? Season of use. So not only did we have the season of use, but we also have the physical access. Some cabins enjoy driving in, even if it's on their own maintained road. Some have to boat in, some have to hike in. Whatever the access is, some enjoy having pretty close access to some type of county maintained road. So we had to take that into account, whatever the situation may have been. Things that we did not take into account, and I think that this is really critical. We did not take into account your permit restrictions. Things that are in the permits that you have signed and accepted, that basically with the Forest Service as your landlords, we tell you how to live on the land with your cabin. So I did not take into account that we tell you what color to paint your cabin. You have to send through all your potential improvements or reconstructions through the Forest Service. You have to come to us to have your trees looked at or marked before you can take them down at your expense. That it is a permit in itself. It's not a lease or it's not any type of fee simple ownership. We don't take into account that we only let you rent it out for a maximum of 2 weeks a year. All those private property rights were not taken into account in the appraisal process.
Why?
Because for one, CAFA said not to, and two, I said your fee was a two-part process. So for us to come up with the market value, it was, like I said, that more that black and white process. It was easier to put on those sideboards for me to come up with a market value of the lot. I don't know how I would have come up with adjustments to equate to, well, we tell you what color to paint your cabin when we're supposed to assume it's a vacant lot. And all those other things. They kind of equate to maybe a CC&R possibly when you buy a piece of property, or like a homeowner's fee, but to me it would still be a good guess. Okay.
How do you take in zoning restrictions such as the zoning restrictions?
Okay, the zoning restrictions of the particular area?
1 story versus a private lot can go 2 stories or sometimes 3 stories.
Okay.
Is that not considered or considered?
It's not really considered because one of those other pretend assumptions is that it's grandfathered into local zoning, okay? Because actually, when you look at recreation residence lots, they're actually, almost every single one of them would be considered a non-conforming use at present day zoning standards. So we would be nationwide looking at lots that you theoretically in the present day probably could never build on, for the most part. I'm not saying all of them, but for the most part.
Okay.
You're saying that when they did the evaluation, they didn't take into consideration the usability of the area?
They took in the usability as it comes to topography, terrain, and that kind of thing.
Obviously, they did.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in just a
They
second.
did that, but they did look at it and say you can develop so much on the lot. As long as it's one building.
What the assumption is, again, it's another one of those assumptions, we said that the permitted use is the highest and best use of the property. That means we did not ask the appraiser to go through a long dissertation of going through all the explanation to come to what he feels is the highest and best use of that particular lot. It was assumed it was for a recreation type residence, only one building site.
Okay, so the highest use of that lot, once it is used, what do you do with the rest of the lot? For example, I use 5,600 square feet for an 880 square foot building. And I've got 17,000 square foot of lot.
Okay.
I cannot use the rest of it. It's on a hill that's undevelopable, and I'm not allowed to develop anything else on it if I wanted to. I couldn't even put a tennis court.
Okay, it would equate to those lots that are in private ownership that still have some of the similar steep topography.
There's nothing similar. You have to realize that this is a wild ass guess.
Okay, this is why on the appraisal process, there was built-in parameters. So there are lots in private ownership that only allow you one building envelope, and the rest of it is steep topography. It's kind of like the...
You have pages of that in here, and none of them equal or are near something I would consider that is appropriate.
Okay, well, we're going to get to the data gathering. When Lance speaks, we're going to address that, but you got to remember, I can't make up data either. Sometimes you have to work with the data that exists. I can't make it up.
There was a hand over here, so I want to make sure that we did.
I think I can talk without the mic. We've gone back and forth over the rental restriction, and I talked to an appraiser who is able to come up with an adjustment for that, and I think there is a difference in highest and best use when it's fee simple absolute with no restrictions at all for rental. When we have people who do have investment properties in the basin, they make a lot of money renting them out. So I don't understand why there's no adjustment made for the 2-week rental restriction.
Because I was told not to make that adjustment. So when you look at the contract specifications that came out under CUFA, that was put out for public comment in the Federal Register notice, all of these, from the appraisal contract specs itself, to the appraisal direction, to everything else, was promulgated from CUFA, which was published in the Federal Register, open to public comment. We commented, we got close to 3,000 comments. We took a lot of those comments under advisement, either made some changes to them or came back with comments as to why we couldn't make those changes. Nationwide, no one has made, because we weren't instructed to make that adjustment for the possibility of renting. That was considered into your 5% fee structure.
Well, I just need to make the follow-up statement that the Act and the regs refer to highest and best use as a recreational residence. And there's a difference. I mean, that in and of itself recognizes a distinction. That's the highest and best use. That's a different highest and best use from an investment property that is unrestricted for rental use and rental income.
Okay.
And so you and I have had the discussion years ago, and so I don't think I'm having a hard time with the fact that you've made this conclusion about excluding that when it's not legally required that you exclude that based on the language in the regs and in the Act, because it's the way highest and best use is defined. You did not define it as a fee simple absolute with no restrictions. It's called a rec residence.
What I think we ought to do is hear the presentation to make sure that we're not jumping around to the point where it's not going to flow in terms of understanding better what the regulations are. But I would encourage folks, if you have questions, just jot them down, because we don't want to lose them, but it's going to be harder to track if we don't keep the flow of the presentation going.
And I just want to say, these are recreation residences, not considered an investment type property for you to rent out and recoup rent on. It's for your personal enjoyment. That was what they were originally permitted out for, okay? And I think that's one of the reasons why we were given that direction. So I just want to go on from there, because I personally, I can't change it, okay? So That's the way it's come down from the promulgated rules.
May I ask how long how long is this? Can I ask you,
Does
how
CUPA,
long is this section?
without having read CUPA in detail, does CUPA require the 5%?
How long is it?
Does it determine the 5% figure?
It does.
Does it determine the limited rental status?
The thought was,
The permit determines the limited rental status. So that food has been changed, can be changed theoretically at any time.
in your permit,
Yes,
correct, it probably could be.
thank you. That's all.
So if your permit's prohibiting something, then there's also always a possibility at some point, whatever process we have to go through to change those specific permit clauses to make that change.
Thank you.
Okay, now Kim, I'm following this agenda, and I'm not sure how many people even have this agenda, but you're on until 10:30, we're already going late, so I want to make sure that you're covering your material and that Lance gets the opportunity to cover his too. And then we have a break from 11 to 11:15. We have Kim back to present from 11:15 to 12. We have an hour lunch from 12 to 1, and then the Q&A follow-up from 1 to 2 this afternoon. So that's the agenda.
That's not a lot of time for Q&A. We've got an hour, right?
Go for it.
We can go longer.
Great.
I will put safety first because I'm driving up the mountain, but I could probably go till 4 and still be okay, but I don't know that everyone else wants to go that long.
Is lunch provided here, or do we go out to get it?
I don't think you're on your own. This is the government. They don't pay for lunch.
You don't do Forest Service either, obviously.
It just depends if you're, if that's the majority, then it is hard to get stuff. But there are things, I don't think there's a prohibition to eat in this room, is there? Okay, yeah, if you wanted to grab something and come back, let's extend the Q&A period as well. So let's just say, unless I hear any objections, we'll go 12 to 12:30 and resume at 12:30 so we can extend the Q&A period. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. I just wanted to kind of get forward a little bit. So that was the premise of the appraisal report itself, taking into all those hypothetical conditions of that lot so we could come in at what we call, off the bat, we quote, market value, okay? Your fee then is 5% of that market value. Again, that was in CUPA. It's almost always been 5%. If you look at one of the handouts that was given out, a little bit of the history explains about CUPA and the history of where we've come from the beginning of time. And you can see where there was some thought given to that 5% number. And Forest Service, Congress, whoever all the powers that be, still settled in on using 5%. Whether it's right or wrong, it's 5%, and that part can't be changed either. And I think in Lance's presentation, he's going to give you from his perspective, being a private contract appraiser, what exactly that difference of 5% means versus something a little higher than 7 to 12%, which is more of a market rate of return. And again, and you've heard me say this, that lower rate was the Forest Service's way, Congress's way, somebody's way of compensating you for putting up with those permit restrictions that wasn't taken into account in the appraisal process. I also want to say before we move on to the next topic is that a lot of folks kind of get mixed up with what their permit fee is versus what their taxes are versus what they're taxed from the county for possessory interest tax, okay? Totally 3 different independent fees. You may all think that they're fees or taxes because a bill always comes to you for those 3 entities. The permit fee from the Forest Service part of it is actually your land rent. It's the rent that you're paying to have that exclusive use, and I'll put exclusive in quotes, for your cabin, personal property, being on public land 365 days a year. Basically, that's what it's for. It's rent. Okay? Possessory interest tax is something the county gets you because of using their county roads and facilities while you're up there enjoying your recreation residence. Then your federal tax, that's a whole nother, you could probably spend days talking about the federal tax rates. But that's independent. Fees do not come back to the National Forest for the permit administration or the administration of all of your recreation residences. It goes right into general treasury. Okay?
And again, if you have more questions, let's just hold those. These are fantastic questions and as anticipated. So we won't steer away from that later. But just continuing with the presentation. So we've talked a little bit about the CUPA history, the 5% fee, that appraisal interview or interval. Those were all key questions that have come up, at least in our office. Now we're going to move to market status, and Lance is going to provide us some information as it pertains to his data collection, comparable sales, and the process that he took. So we'll turn over to Lance.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thank you again for having me. Real quick, I'm just going to go over some of the basics of what I have to do from a valuation standpoint that I considered in the analysis. It was documented in the appraisal, but I want to review some of that as I go forward. Just as a real quick comment as a follow-up of what Kim said, and that is in regards to the relationship between the value that was provided and the overall and the rate that they're talking about. Strictly from a market valuation basis, the 5% is probably 100% below market. What I mean by that is there's a certain amount of accuracy to the statement that's in the CUPA fee that the market rate for ground leases, and that's what the ground rent you're paying, is somewhere between 7 and 12%. If you use a 10% cap rate or ground rent rate and apply it to any value of a lot, your annual rental rate will be double. As an example, if a lot is $100,000 and you use a 5% rate, which is what CUPA stipulates, the annual rate is $5,000. If you use a 10% market rate, it's $10,000. So that's how the numbers work. So I won't get into discussion until Q&A time about whether it's fair or not fair or otherwise. But in relationship to the market, the 5% is about half of what the market would consider to be an appropriate rate for your total lots. That does not account for the actual value of the lot, which is further discounted from the market. Yes, sir.
An example of lot at 10%. What kind of market value is it? A parking lot? What would you get 10% return on? Give me an example of kind of lot.
I'll give you an example. The safest ground rent that you probably can have is a fast food restaurant for the most part. You have McDonald's behind it. You have Jack in the Box.
And you're using that as a...
No, sir. All I'm saying is that the safest, least risky cap rate for land is probably represented in a fast food restaurant backed by a billion-dollar company like McDonald's. Those cap rates are around 7%. Okay, that's my best reference point. Anything above 7% would be a non-McDonald's. That's my best way of saying it. So let me go a little bit on how we go forward. I just wanted to tag off of what Kim said a little bit in regards to rates and analysis. What I did look at in regards to your lot is a real fundamental concept, and that's highest and best use. Highest and best use is based on one primary thing, and that's what Kim also indicated, was as a rec residence. And I indicate here that it's a rec residence, period. That is with, I'll be with you in a second, sir.
When you say market rate, what do you mean? The sell price of the lot, comparable sell price of the lot?
I'll use your terminology. That would be a fair statement.
I'm a little confused. You're a permittee on the government land that lots cannot be sold.
I'm not debating that, sir. All I'm saying is that as a...
How much a lot that's unsellable is worth?
Oh, okay, just real quick, I'll get with you just a second.
I just want to make a statement. Can't we please hold the questions and let you guys get through your presentation? Because I want to get to the questions, but I'm never going to get to my question if we keep interrupting you.
I like to get the question when it's germane.
Well, I don't want to hear any questions because that's the rules.
All right, I'll finish off here. So highest and best use is where I have to go. It is a rec residence lot. A couple of key points that I do identify, what I call the buyer profile. That's probably the most important concept in regards to highest and best use is I have to identify who the typical buyer is. for that particular lot. And I indicate here that, and I say it's a second home buyer, that a second home buyer reflects that the subject market is typically searching in mountain corridors in the Tahoe Basin and surrounding areas. The buyer is attracted to remote or semi-remote areas that can be accessed via paved or dirt roads. Hike-in or boat-in lots are rare and usually are associated with public lands. The second home buyers enjoy a high amenity location with trees, views, water, mountains, or both, with basic infrastructure. This buyer is not a year-round resident, but rather travels from more urban areas anywhere from 1 to 3 hours. Seasonality, not necessarily access. What I mean by seasonality is can you get to it? Just in regards to what's dealing with today with the snow up in the Tahoe area, is due to the high snowfall during the winter months where the roads become blocked or unusable. That's the buyer profile. That's what I looked at in regards to what might be typical for a representative of your lots. I used 17 sales. I will tell you right now, at that time in the marketplace, 2010, it was probably the worst time in the market. The values represented at that point in time were at the absolute bottom. And I mean that from a factual standpoint for one reason and one reason only. Very difficult to find data. Very difficult, especially with the limitations that were imposed regarding the highest and best use issue. If I were to look at those lots today, it would be 30 to 40% higher, simply as a function of the marketplace. I'm not saying that's what's happening here. I'm back in 2010. I'm looking at this from a market perspective. So in 2010, there were 17 sales that I was able to provide that were in non-urban areas. That was a condition that also had to be met. So you'll see that some of the data in here is over 100 miles away, so that I could properly represent the buyer profile that's in this list. The buyer profile being a remote, semi-remote parcel. I had to expand my search. I had no choice. Yes, sir.
Number one, were all these lots you surveyed unimproved lots?
They were a combination of unimproved, semi-improved, and had physical limitations for one reason or the other.
In the case of improved lots, what percentage did you attribute to the lot itself?
Well, I think in the Q&A part I can help you a little bit.
I don't want to wait several hours to have the Q&A part. This is pertinent. Would you just answer the question? Did you have 1/3, 1/2? What did you use?
I didn't make my comparison based on a percentage. I did a bracketing methodology, which is appropriate in valuing lots like this.
Oh, really?
Yes, sir. I probably in the Q&A, I'll probably address a little bit more about market conditions, but I told you where the market was at the time. And then I factored in the usual components that any appraiser is going to look at, and that would be when you're looking at the quantitative aspects, that would be like market conditions, time, and other factors that might come into play. And then there's the physical issues that come into play: location, utilities, access, topography. So all of those were factored in. And you'll notice that in the appraisals that were provided, not all 17 comps could be used for a particular lot. They wouldn't be comparable, but I did isolate based on commonality and a ranking system what was appropriate in regards to a specific lot and which comps were most appropriate for that lot. I tried to use a comparable basis of at least 3 or 4 comps that would be comparable. It would be unfair to you if I threw in a view lot, a lake view lot, on a lot that you might own that did not have a lake view lot. So I did not do that. We can get into that later, I suppose. So that's just an overview on how I handled the valuation process. Can you have any thoughts or comments?
Hello. Again, I'm going to ask folks to just jot down their questions because, again, we have lots of material to cover. And as we're all learning through this, because I believe it is a learning curve here in understanding the law as it was written, how it was promulgated, that was discussed earlier, and the professional skill that goes into property appraisal. Now we have the next segment. These will generate questions, I know, from many of you, so just go ahead and jot those down. We do need to make sure we cover the information, and we also need to make sure that we are respectfully engaging in this dialogue to achieve clarity and better understanding. It is not intended to weigh in on whether we like the act or not. It is the law of the land that we are required to administer, and so it's really a point to achieve clarity and understanding so we know what was the practice behind these assessments and how can we better understand them, and then formulate questions for gaining better understanding as the process moves along. So I appreciate your indulgence in jotting down your questions and then holding on to them for the Q&A session. Thank you.
I have nothing to add. We're almost on time for a break. Let me just tap on a little bit there, and let me just try to deflate the tension balloon that might be slowly building. I don't want us to conflate our disagreement that is obviously out there regarding CUFA and the process of CUFA with what we're presenting today. Again, we've been provided very specific direction on how to implement fees going forward. That may change. Jay Tripathi might be the guy to talk to at a break about how about that change. But again, right now we're still tasked with implementing CUFA. And I want to just make sure that that is plainly obvious to you all, because I don't want this tension balloon to get any larger. We're going to answer questions today regarding this process and how we move forward. All right? Let's go ahead and break for, 10 minutes? 15 minutes? We want to make it shorter and get back earlier? All right, let's quick break, 10 minutes, we'll see you back. I'll give you the exact time. We'll see you back here at 11:05.
Are you involved with the national? Steve Tallman.
Hi, Jonathan.
Yeah. We met.
Did we meet at the meeting? I'm sorry.
Well, ironically enough, the first time we met was 3 years ago at the first appraisal meeting.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
And, you were there with Lori, and I showed you my shack.
Oh, yeah, okay. That was a great trip. It was a big thunderstorm, if I remember correctly.
It was...
Remember we had that big hailstorm. We ended up picking up and rescuing some family that was stranded.
It was an eventful day, to be sure. That was the first shock we all got, I think, about what was coming down. I agree with you. I think there's a lot that needs to be sort of settled out yet. And what I'm mainly here for is to try and figure out more about the second appraisal process.
And I think this next one, and I'll start it with, what's the counter to all this?
Okay.
If folks feel there is factual inconsistencies, CUFA says the second appraisal process is how we resolve that.
Yeah, because I was looking in, I was trying to figure out there was a couple of questions I had. One was, can we just use any old appraiser, or do we have to find someone through them, or what's the deal with that?
There are some, if you go in the back of the room and ask, Cheryl O'Brien, right?
Yeah.
Ask Cheryl O'Brien for the second appraisal. We have some blanket paperwork that we've been sending out to folks, but if you want to see an example of what does the letter say, we've got some in the back of the room.
Okay, and then the other was...
They have to be a general appraiser, they have to have knowledge of rural areas, rural markets, things of that nature.
Okay.
But you can use anyone as long as they kind of fit that mark, and then Kim would do the approving on that.
Oh, okay. And then secondly, does she have to do the approving before they do the appraisal, or as to who's going to do the appraisal?
Ask that of Kim on this next section. Because that question too, I don't mind if folks have a quick question they want to pop in. And that might be one of those that you can quickly say, hey, how does that work? And then Kim can answer right in her section.
Yeah, I think we're going to scream and holler about things. It should be done after the second appraisal, in my opinion.
I hope so.
And then the other thing is, I read something that seemed interesting.
Here, let me get down from here.
As far as interpretation of the valuation and then what your fee is or something like that. It seemed like there was something in
You're stealing my
thunder, but what happens here is you have two appraisals, right? If you guys choose to do a second appraisal, it gets accepted.
Right.
Then Nancy has two values, and then she gets to decide the fee based on that range of values.
No, actually, what I meant was, it seems like there was some verbiage in what was sent to us about how if
phase in.
No, actually, you know what? Maybe you just answered my question, but I'm not sure. Maybe I'll go back and read it so I'm clear on that. But the other question I had was, those other things that I talked to you about, and then you went off down to Yuba, I guess.
Yes.
So we kind of lost track on that. I just wanted to know if you were going to be around later, or were you going to have to leave before the meeting was over?
I'll be here all day. I'll be here until probably 3.
So maybe I'll have a chance to talk to you just a few minutes after the end of the meeting?
Yes.
Okay,
I'm going to be clear going back up. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Tom McKinney.
Jonathan.
Jonathan, you're doing a good job trying to keep tensions down.
I don't mind a little tension. I really don't. I like it. And, in some ways I like it. I just want folks to understand. I don't
like blind people questions. I will ask some questions. Kim mentioned sideboard.
Yes.
I don't understand that. Is it written in the law, sideboards?
Much of it is, yes. Much of the direction regarding private ownership, what to consider, that's all written in the law.
That's written in the law.
Is that what's in the forms back there?
Yes, go for it. I'm Jonathan, by the way. Have we met? Nice to meet you.
Rainbow.
Excellent.
When somebody asks a question and they're not using the mic,
I know it's really hard.
Very good.
Ours is 21. Different. Very different.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
Jonathan said that there was some paperwork back here as far as trying to get the second appraisal.
Yes, right here. This grab that, and this goes to that left-hand second appraisal. Okay.
Thank you, dear.
You're welcome.
Is Hillary here?
Yeah, she is. Hillary is up.
She was up there last I saw, right now on the board.
She's the youngest one here. Yeah.
She's the one on the board over there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, what's the process? And I know that they're probably going to go through it here, maybe in this next section, but if we find an appraiser who has some experience in rural areas, do we have to submit their name to these people first and say, hey, you have to prove them? Because that seems like a bit of a conflict of interest.
So basically, how it's going to run, hi, I'm Noelle Glenfovio. I work at the regional office for the Forest Service.
Oh, okay.
I'm the program assistant for special use for Region 5.
Oh, okay.
So at the end of the day...
You're even further up the food
Yes,
chain.
right.
Wow.
I'm down here. No? There's kind of this layering that goes on. It's quite an interesting organization, to say the least. But I know that the appraisers are going to go through it. There is a process, and you do have to submit paperwork to the regional appraiser, which would.
I'm doing well, and you?
So there is that. There's that also. So you do have to work with us when it comes to even the second appraise. Are you going to get one on your own, or are you going to do it as a group?
Well, that's I'm the.
Because you have that leeway.
Yeah, and that was another question: is can we do it that way? Because I'm the head of our 6 cabins at the end of Cathedral Road.
Okay.
And so it would make sense for us, since we all have to go off the same piece of property anyways.
Okay.
It would make sense for us all to kind of go in on it together, I would imagine.
I think it would, just for the fact that it might make it cheaper. You are the ones that are needed. At this point, the second appraisal is on the owner. It's on the permit, the cabin, permitted cabin holder. So I think it would make it cheaper, in the long run, to get a group appraised instead of just one by one single appraised with a bunch of different appraisers.
Right. I see.
It's good.
Of course, we could play all of our cards if we wanted. We could go, okay, well, this
appraisal,
right, and then take the best one and use that if we wanted.
Well, I don't know if it's really taking the best one because
each cabin's responsible for their own.
Right, but you guys.
But it's all of the same lot.
Right.
In our case.
Right, but you guys. So if you
Actually, it's that way for the whole our whole tract.
So if each individual tract, each individual lot in the tract decides to get an appraisal, just one, simultaneously, so one.
Right.
So, you know, all of that information would be taken into account at the end of the day with the forest supervisor. So, you know, there is still that. So there's the appraisal that comes out, and you see that it might be different, which, you know, I don't know too much about the whole entire process because I'm not specifically, that's not my job. But if you start to see all of these differences, then I would imagine that at that point in time, that information gathered would go to the forest supervisor and the regional appraiser, and there would probably be some type of a, you know, meeting with talk about that.
My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is it's our responsibility if we want to get a second appraisal.
Yes.
But if we don't like what they come back with, we're under no obligation to turn it in.
That's right.
So what I'm saying is that for our 6 all of our 6 cabins that are actually on 6 different plots, all of our assessment is based on one lot. So all 6 cabins are going to be getting, if they all went out and got their own assessments, would still be on that same piece of property. Now, assuming that they don't all use the same appraiser, they're all going to come back with different values. So let's say that all 6 cabins decide to get their own appraisal, and then we put our heads together and we decide, okay, well, this is the lowest one. That's the one we're going to submit. We're not going to submit these other 5. Is there anything wrong with doing that?
I actually don't know. That's a pretty technical question, and
well, this is a very technical situation.
No, it is, and I think that should be a question asked during the Q&A.